Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. So, we had started one of the preambles of Meezan, which of course is a book authored by Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. We have already finished off one of the other preambles, which is regarding the whole framework of Islam. And this preamble, which of course is an introduction to the whole book, relates to the principles of understanding the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Hadith. Also, in our previous session, we have looked upon how these sources of religion emanate from Prophet Muhammad. The Quran and the Sunnah are the only two original sources of religion. And as far as Hadith literature is concerned, it basically is something which explains these two sources, or at the same time also presents how the Prophet himself went about practically following this religion. So his exemplar is also enshrined in Hadith literature. We had also seen that as far as Hadith literature is concerned, it is primarily something that took place or whose dissemination took place at the behest of the companions themselves. They felt motivated to hear what the Prophet had to say to them, and they wanted to share it with other people. The Prophet himself never ever made any arrangements to have this disseminated. The Sunnah, we also saw, is a bunch of practices that have been relayed by Prophet Abraham and from him, of course, and these practices relate to mostly religious etiquette, mannerisms, and worship rituals, and at the same time some dietary habits. So today we are going to start a subcategory of this chapter, and this relates to the principles of understanding the Quran. These are 10 principles, and these 10 principles can of course be summed up and seen in the slide that is being displayed before you. So we will take up each of these principles as they have been outlined by Ustaz Ghamidi. So these 10 principles, as you can see from the very text, they include the appreciation of classical Arabic, eloquence of language, uniqueness of style, of course referring to the style of the Quran. The Quran is the final authority, parallel verses and construction, also called Nazair. Then the sixth principle is to regard the Quran as the final book on religion. The seventh is that it is a chronicle of Prophet Muhammad's inzar or warning. The eighth principle relates to the coherence in the discourse, which means that the surahs and the verses, how they are coherently and sequentially arranged. The ninth principle relates to the overall structure and arrangement of the Quran. And finally, the 10th principle relates to the historical background in which the Quran was revealed. Of course, there were previous scriptures, to which the Quran is the final sequel. So we'll take up all these 10 principles as they have been outlined by Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. Each of these principles is very important in its own self. These principles are like a guiding light which shines when we are trying to interpret and infer from the Quran. So we'll start off with the very first principle, which is appreciation of classical Arabic. Now, the Quran has been revealed in classical Arabic spoken in Mecca. It was spoken in the age of Jahiliyyah by the tribe of Quraysh. So the Almighty has endowed it with inimitable eloquence and articulacy. Yet, as far as its substance is concerned, it is no different from the one spoken by Prophet Muhammad himself, and in which in those times, of course, people of Mecca did speak. So the Quran calls this as the tongue of the Quraysh, and it is here that the Quran has specifically referred at one instance and addressed the Prophet and said, فَإِنَّمَا يَسَّرْنَاهُ بِلِسَانِكَ لِتُبَشِّرَ بِهِ الْمُتَّقِينَ وَتُنْزِرَ بِهِ قَوْمًا لُدًّا. Thus, O Prophet, we have made this Quran very easy and apt in your tongue, so that through it you may proclaim glad tidings to those who fear, and fully warn these stubborn people through it. A correct understanding of this book is dependent on the correct knowledge and true appreciation of this language. It is essential that a person who wants to reflect on the Quran and who attempts to interpret and explain it should be a very competent and a very adept scholar of this language. He should be very well versed in appreciating the styles and linguistic features of the Quran, of course, which are called the stylistics. And as far as this fact is concerned, we also need to understand that the language of the Quran, which every student of this divine book should be well aware of, is that Arabic which, of course, was the Arabic in which poets, in which classical Arabic poets composed their couplets. It is not the Arabic in which poets like Hariri, who lived in the 6th century, and Mutanabbi, who lived in the 4th century, composed their masterpieces. Nor is it the Arabic in which Zamakhshari, who lived in the 6th century, and Razi, who died in the 7th century, wrote their commentaries on the Quran. It is also not the Arabic of the newspapers which are published in current times in Arab countries, nor is it the Arabic prose and poetry written by their literati of today. Now, no doubt, these are also samples of Arabic, but this Arabic that we find today being read and taught in the Arab countries and splashed on their newspapers and on their news channels, it is very different from the Arabic of the Quran. And the difference in this vocabulary, the vocabulary of the current or Arabic language, its idiom, its style, its construction, is so different from classical Arabic that one can see this difference if one is a connoisseur of both these aspects of language. So this difference can be gauged, for example, by understanding that just as the Urdu and Persian of Ghalib and Mir, the two celebrated poets of the Urdu and Persian languages, and of course Sadi and Khayyam, also very established poets. So the Urdu and Persian of the newspapers and journals of the Indian subcontinent and Iran, of course, is entirely different from the Urdu and Persian of these poets. Similarly, this difference can be gauged if one compares the wide difference in the English of Shakespeare, who lived in the 17th century, and Milton, who also lived in the 17th century, and the one written and spoken in Britain today, for example. It is thus an essential reality that not only contemporary or medieval Arabic has no role in creating any appreciation of the language, this Arabic of today is in fact detrimental to the very appreciation of the classical language of the Quran. And if one becomes totally involved in it, he may end up losing his understanding of the Quran. This is something that has to be understood by every student of the Quran, that today's Arabic is so different from the Arabic of the Quran. The very first thing which a person must turn to in order to understand the language of the Quran, you know what? It is the Quran itself. No one can deny the fact that when it was revealed, the people of Mecca did indeed dispute its divinity for a long time. But no one was able to challenge its language. It said that it was not the work of a non-Arab because it was revealed in the most articulate Arabic. It declared itself to be a miracle of language and literature, and that of lucidity and eloquence, and dared the Quraysh to produce a surah like it. So much so, it challenged them to bring to their aid their literati, their poets, their soothsayers, orators, and even their jinn, devils, and deities. But it is an irrefutable reality that none among the Arabs could refute the magnificence of its language and the splendor of its style. And this is precisely why the Quran at one instance has challenged them, and as yet we don't have an answer to this challenge. So the Quran says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. This is the message of this book, accept it. And if you have any doubt about what we have revealed to our servant, of course referring to Prophet Muhammad, then go and produce just one surah like it. And for this, call upon all your supporters except God, if you are truthful, in this claim. And then a similar verse is, قُلْ إِنِ اجْتَمَعَتِ الْإِنسُ وَالْجِنُّ عَلَىٰ أَنْ يَأْتُوا بِمِثْلِ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ لَا يَأْتُونَ بِمِثْلِهِ وَلَوْ كَانَ بَعْضُهُمْ لِبَعْضٍ ظَهِيرًا. Tell them, if men and jinn combined to produce a book like this Quran, they would be unable to do so, even if they become helpers of one another. So you can see that how important it is and how structurally significant it is to understand that the inimitability of the Quran, that it cannot be copied, is something that has stood the test of time for 15 centuries. And in those times, Walid bin Mughira, who was one of the finest critics of the language in Mecca of those times, when he heard the Quran, his response was something that totally dumbfounded the Arabic world. And his words, if I could quote them, were that, by God, none among you is more aware than me of poetry, neither martial songs nor eulogies, nor the incantation of the jinn. By God, the words spoken by this person resemble none of these. So Walid bin Mughira is commenting on the Quran and telling us that nothing whatsoever that we already know of, neither anything which is poetic or prosaic, nor anything which relates to the jinn, has any parallel with the Quran. It cannot be equated with the Quran. So his words are, by God, the words spoken by this person resemble none of these. And by God, his words are very pleasant and lively. Its branches are laden, referring to the Quran, with fruit. Its roots are well watered. It will definitely dominate everything, and nothing will be able to dominate it, and it will crush everything below it. So Walid bin Mughira was a person that you have to understand that he was one of the outstanding and one of the most distinguished critics of his times. And it is his admission that we have just seen how magnificent this admission was. From among the poets of the Al-Mu'allaqat As-Sabr, so now this is a composition of classical Arabic poems, and they are, of course, they are odes, and as the name shows, Al-Mu'allaqat As-Sabr, it means the 7 hanging odes, because these odes would be hung on the walls of the Kaaba. And from amongst these poets of these Sabr Mu'allaqat, the 7 poets, Labid was alive at that time, and a poet of the caliber of Al-Frazdak prostrated on one of his couplets. However, he too was dumbfounded before the Quran, and when the Caliph Umar wished to hear his poetry from him, he replied, how can I recite my couplets after God has taught me Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran? So such was the outstanding caliber that this is what Labid had to say. Now, this was not merely the admission of a single person. It meant that the whole eloquence of the Arabs had surrendered before the sublimity of the Quran. It is also something that we have to reckon with, that this astounding miracle of language and literature has been transmitted to us without any change whatsoever. It is an acknowledged fact that the Quran is not only the final and ultimate authority in all matters of religion, it also represents the final criterion and standard for the language of its times. Now, after the Quran, we can find this language in the ahadith of the Prophet and the athar of the companions. So, a glimpse of how this classical Arabic can be found on scene is in the works or in the words of, we can say, of the Prophet and the companions. And we also know that a very small portion of them has been transmitted verbatim, and thus it cannot be presented as a criterion and a representative of classical Arabic. Yet whatever portion we have of it is a great treasure for students of this language. This is the language of the Prophet, whose eloquence is matchless, and that of the companions who spoke in the same diction. So the prophetic ahadith and the athar of the companions both have some aspect of verbatim words being preserved. So a lot of words are basically transmitted by a narrator the way he understood them, and so on and so forth. But there are some aspects and some small portion that has been preserved verbatim, which means the words of the Prophet and the companions have been preserved. Like, for example, in the supplications and some of the very pithy sentences of the Prophet, they are preserved, and we can see from their diction how they are the best examples in which the Arabic language of those times stood. And the original words have been preserved, of course, we can see in some of his conversations also, and also in the various parables and similes that he's stated to explain some aspect of religion. The parallels of this language can be observed in these types of narratives the most. The supplication narratives, the parables of the Prophet that he would narrate in order to make people understand religion, and of course his conversations with his Sahaba, with the companions. So if students of the Quran consult these sources, they can gather invaluable samples of classical Arabic which can help them in understanding both difficult words as well as the background and occasions on which they are spoken in the Quran. Now, after these three, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Asar, the greatest source for classical Arabic literature is the classical literature of the Arabs themselves. Within the corpus of this literature are the works of very distinguished and celebrated poets like Imrul Qais, Zuhair, Amr bin Kulthum, Labid himself, who was alive at that time, Al-Nabigha, Tarfa, Antara, Asha, Haris bin Halizza, and orators like Qus ibn Sa'ida. He was an outstanding orator. He could hold the audience spellbound. So scholars of this field know that a greater part of this literature is found in the anthologies of the poets and the literati of those times. And these anthologies are called Asmayat, Mufaddaliyat, Hamasa, and Al-Mu'allaqatu Sab that we just referred to. And of course in the works of these highly honorable literary scholars like Jahiz and Al-Mubarrad. Many collections of the poetical works of those times have now been published, which were not available to date. So this is something of a recent happening. Undoubtedly, a greater part of the Arabic language has been transmitted to us through consensus and tawatur and is preserved in primary works like At-Tahzib, Al-Muhkam. So these are the names of the Arabic lexicons, As-Siha, Al-Jamhura, Al-Nihaya. But this is also a fact that the greatest source of the portion of the language which has not been transmitted through tawatur is also the classical Arabic literature of that age. So it does not have some portions which were concocted later. I mean, it could have some portions and attribute to that age. But so just as an expert jeweler can distinguish a fake from an original in the very same manner, scholars of hadith can distinguish between rightly and wrongly reported narratives in the same manner as critics of the Arabic language can distinguish the original from the concocted on the basis of objective standards of textual criticism. It is for this very reason that the scholars of language and literature are unanimous on the fact that after the Quran, it is this classical literature which can be depended upon and which, because of its integrity in transmission and verbatim nature of transmission, occupies the ultimate standard in research on the language of the Quran. So Abdul Qadir al-Baghdadi, I would like to read out an excerpt from his so that we are able to understand that how these classical Arabic literature, we can adduce parallels from this classical Arabic literature. So it says that a discourse which parallels from which parallels are presented to substantiate the meanings of words and phrases is of two types: poetry and prose. The first of these has been divided by scholars into four categories. The first category is of poets who belong to the Jahiliyyah period that prevailed in Arabia before Islam, and an example of these two poets are Imrul Qais and Al-Asha. This is the first category. The second is of the Al-Mukhadramun, who lived in both pre-Islamic and Islamic times, such as Labid and Hassan ibn Sabit. So this is the second category of poets, and they are called the Mukhadramun because they were able to live in the Jahiliyyah period and also in the Islamic period. The third category is of the Mutaqaddimun, who are also called the Islamiyun. These are poets who belong to the first period of Islam, such as Jarir and Al-Frazdak. So they belong to the first period of Islam. These are poets. The fourth is the Muwallidun, who are also called the Muhdisun. Included in this category are all poets who belong to the period after the three categories until our own time, such as Bashar ibn Bard and Abu Nawas. There is a consensus that parallels to substantiate the meanings of words and phrases shall be drawn from the poets of the first two categories only. So Abdul Qadir ibn Umar al-Baghdadi, in his Khazanatul Adab fi Lubb al-Lubab Lisan al-Arab, a very outstanding work of his, has said, and this is something that is reported as a consensus from all other scholars as well, that only individuals, only people who belong to the Jahili period and only people who belong to the Mukhadramun period, which means the period that overlaps Jahiliyyah and Islam, who lived in these two periods, only works from these two categories shall be adduced from as parallels to the Quran, because the later Arabic started to become different. So the people who lived in the first period of Islam and people who lived after that. So we know that as far as the Mutaqaddimun are concerned and the Muwallidun are concerned, so both these categories of poets and literature, people who compose literature shall not be adduced from, and something that has to be very, very carefully observed. Now, quite similarly, Umar ibn al-Khattab is also reported to have said, he said that if you preserve your poetry, you will not go astray. People asked, what are our poetic collections? He said, the poetry of the Jahiliyyah period, because it contains the tafsir of your book and also the meanings of your language. This is what Umar ibn al-Khattab has said. Abdullah ibn Abbas, also a very famous companion of the Prophet, he is reported to have said something similar. He says, if you want to understand the meaning of a Quranic word little known to you, look for it in poetry, because it is this poetry which is the record of the Arabs. So as far as the Quran is concerned, we can find parallels from this classical Arabic poetry, as has been cited both by Abdullah ibn Umar and Umar ibn Khattab himself. Another thing which needs to be appreciated is that this classical literature of the Jahiliyyah period is not only a source of the language and its various styles, it also reflects the culture and civilization of the Arabs. Not just language, but their culture also. So, if a person does not have the right knowledge about these, it becomes difficult for him to understand the various references, allusions, and figures of speech which are the real constituents of this masterpiece of literature. What were the characteristics of the society of Arabs? What were the things they regarded as maruf and munkar? What were the standards of good and evil in their society? What was the nature of their religion and traditions? What were the foundations of their culture, and what were the constituents of their social fabric? Similarly, what was their political ideologies and daily involvements and engagements? Were they really a bunch of uncivilized people whom Islam elevated to the status of the conquerors of the world? Or, in spite of their savageness, they did possess certain features and characteristics which made them eligible to receive a book as lofty as the Quran, and they were bestowed with the status of witnesses, as we know from the Quran, that they were shuhada al-nas. And if we realize that the correct answer to all these questions is found only in this book, and it is this answer through which the various allusions, references, insinuations, and implications of the Quran become evident to its student with their truly literary splendor and meaningfulness. So we can say that it is not merely for language, but also all of these things to understand their history, their culture, their background, the way they spoke, the way they would treat one another, the way they would fight wars. So all of these become evident from that literature, and a student of the Quran will find this to be indispensable. So this, viewers, is the importance of the classical Arabic of the times of the Quran. So first thing that we have to understand that it is entirely different from the language that we study or teach or even read in the Arabic countries of today. So it should not be any cause of confusion that if today's Arabs are not able to fully understand or grasp the Quran, it is quite something that we would understand, because the Arabic of the Quran is very different from the Arabic of today's world. However, the samples of that Arabic, as we have seen, can be seen in the Quran itself, it can be seen in the Hadith literature, in the Asar literature, and next in classical Arabic literature. And that has been preserved. And we have seen celebrated authorities like Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas anhum saying that whenever you find any difficulty in understanding a word or a construction, you can look at its parallels in this literature which is found and available today. So today is going to be a shortened session. We will not move any further, and we'll have just 5 minutes of questions, 5 or maybe 6, 7 minutes, and we will end after that. So over to you, Mariam, for any questions.
So you gave the lecture about the Arabic language, but don't you think it's very difficult that we deeply dive into some language and really get the actual essence of the language that prevailed about 2,000 years ago?
So you see, yeah, I do get your point. So see, this is for the scholarly understanding of the Quran. This is not meant for everyone. So a person who would like to become a doctor of the Quran, a doctor of the Arabic language of the Quran, and he would like to interpret the Quran and understand the Quran, a really professional scholar, this standard and these guidelines have been given for him. So as far as people who would like to just read a good translation of the Quran, or maybe simply have a grasp of Quranic Arabic in order to grasp the meaning of the verses, they are not required to go and delve so deep in the Quran. So remember, the principles of understanding of the Quran, they are not meant for everyone, and everyone is not meant to interpret the Quran. It is the mufassirun, the exegetes of the Quran, the scholars of the Quran, for which these guidelines have been laid down. So as far as common man is concerned, as far as people like us are concerned, it is sufficient that we are able to grasp the Quranic Arabic of the times of the Quran itself from various apps that have been introduced in the last couple of years, and with many websites which give you a brief construction of the Arabic language, and with the direct method they are able to take you through the Quran, and it's like a journey that you go and undertake from the Quran, and this is how you just understand the meaning of the Quran. So in no way is it being recommended that people who would just like to understand the basics of the Quran should go and delve deeper. So this is just meant for the scholars and the professionals of the Quran who would like to undertake a studious study of the Quran.
Salman Aziz, you can ask your follow-up as well.
Well, sir, where does the ayat Fahal min Muddakir stand then? And that ayah has some innate meaning that it is meant for the common people or for the scholars.
So you see, that verse is generally mistranslated. So generally the verse is وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ, that we have made the Quran very easy for you. So that is how the translation that you might have read is generally put forth. So the word taysir in the Quran does not mean easy. It means that it has been made appropriate. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ means that the language of the Quran has been made very appropriate to remind you of the facts that have been laid down in the Quran. For hal mim mudakkir would mean, so is there anyone who would pay heed to it? So the word, this verse itself needs to be revisited, because the general translation is that the Quran is very easy. So that is not the correct translation. It is the Quran is very appropriate for being a book of reminding people of the facts that are found in it. So the word taysir doesn't mean something which is easy. It means something which is appropriate for a particular objective.
I think that was all the time that we had, since we're very close to the end of the Q&A. So inshallah, see you tomorrow in another session of textual study of the Quran.